On a chilly November morning, downtown Boston was alive with its usual hum of activity. The streets bustled with the determined footsteps of workers, the sporadic honking of impatient drivers, and the rhythmic rustle of fallen leaves swept up by the brisk wind. Among the crowd was Robert Kensington, a man who seemed to embody the city's unrelenting pace. At 56 years old, Robert exuded an air of authority, his sharp navy blue suit tailored to perfection, the glossy leather of his shoes reflecting the pale November sunlight. Robert moved with purpose, his phone pressed to his ear, issuing clipped commands to whoever was on the other end of the line. His words were decisive, his tone cold. To those who passed by, he appeared as a man who had never paused long enough to question the weight of his own ambitions. He paused abruptly as his path was blocked by a woman sweeping the sidewalk, a figure so different from him it seemed almost surreal. Eleanor Mayfield stood hunched over her broom, her frail frame wrapped in an oversized grey coat that had seen far better days. The lines etched into her face told the story of a life weathered by time and hardship. Her hands, gnarled and trembling slightly, gripped the wooden handle as she worked methodically to clear the debris scattered by the autumn wind. Robert's irritation was immediate. He had little patience for inconvenience, and this elderly street sweeper represented everything he viewed as inefficient and unnecessary. He stopped just short of her and muttered with a sneer, "You should have retired years ago." His voice was low but sharp enough to slice through the hum of the street, and it hung in the air like a cold breath on a frosty morning. Eleanor froze. She didn't look up, but the words struck her like a blow. Her hands paused on the broom, and her shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of the insult added to the burden she already carried. She whispered a quiet response, though it was lost in the noise of the city, her face, worn but still kind, clouded with sadness. Robert walked on without a second glance, leaving behind a woman whose dignity had been momentarily bruised but not broken. Eleanor straightened herself, her grip on the broom tightening as if to steady her resolve. Her movements resumed, though slower this time, each sweep of the broom a silent act of defiance. Around her, the city continued its march forward, indifferent to the exchange. Commuters hurried past, eyes fixed on their phones or watches, oblivious to the small drama that had unfolded in their midst. Yet, for Eleanor, the moment lingered like a shadow, a reminder of how easily people's humanity could be disregarded. For Robert, it was an incident forgotten almost as soon as it occurred. To him, it was no more significant than the changing of a traffic light or the ringing of a distant church bell. But the city, ever watchful, seemed to hold its breath for what was to come. A subtle anticipation that the paths of these two very different lives were about to intertwine in ways neither could yet imagine. The morning air, sharp with the crispness of late autumn, settled over Eleanor Mayfield as she finished her shift. She leaned briefly on her broom, gazing at the city she had swept for decades. The cold had seeped into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the ache of the memories that stirred within her. She thought of the man who had walked past her earlier. His words lingered, not for their cruelty, but for the indifference they carried, a reflection of the world that often saw her as invisible. Eleanor had not always been a street sweeper. In her youth, she was full of life and dreams, a young wife with her heart set on raising a family in the modest house her husband, Charles, had built with his own hands. They had been happy once, laughing at the small absurdities of life and planning for a future that, in their minds, seemed limitless. But life, as it often does, had a way of dismantling dreams with quiet cruelty. Charles left when their son, Daniel, was just a boy. The departure came without warning, only a curt note left on the kitchen table. Eleanor never truly understood why he left. She had done her best to hold the household together, but the absence of Charles was a wound that never fully healed. Still, it was her son who kept her moving forward. Daniel was a bright light, his laughter filling the small spaces of their home, his ambition shining like a beacon. Then came the day the light went out. It was a winter morning, not unlike the one she now stood in when the police officer knocked on her door. Daniel, at 19, had been in a car accident on the icy roads outside of town. He had not survived. The grief had been so profound that for a time, Eleanor wondered if she would survive it. But she did, though not without losing pieces of herself along the way. Eleanor's life became one of quiet endurance. She took the job sweeping streets because it allowed her to remain unnoticed, her sorrow blending into the noise of the city. Yet, despite the hardships, she found small ways to bring kindness to others. A warm meal left for a neighbor who had fallen on hard times. A few extra dollars slipped to the young boy who delivered her groceries. These acts were her only solace, though she sought no recognition for them. Robert Kensington, meanwhile, sat in the corner office of his gleaming skyscraper, unaware of the weight Eleanor carried. To him, life was a battlefield where success was the only reward worth fighting for. Born into modest means, Robert had risen to wealth and power with relentless determination, cutting ties and severing relationships that he deemed unnecessary along the way. His mother, Martha Kensington, had been one such casualty. A widow who had dedicated her life to philanthropy, Martha was a woman of quiet grace, known throughout the community for her generosity. Yet, her son had seen her values as a hindrance to ambition. Robert had visited her only rarely, even as she grew older and her health began to fail. By the time of her passing, their relationship had been reduced to brief, obligatory calls on holidays. But Martha's legacy lived on in ways Robert did not yet understand. Her contributions to the local hospital had saved lives, and her presence in the lives of others, including Eleanor Mayfield, was far greater than her son realized. For Eleanor, Martha had been a friend in the quiet years after Daniel's death. They met at the hospital, where Eleanor had gone not as a patient but as a donor. A chance conversation had led to an enduring friendship, one that had been a lifeline for Eleanor when she needed it most. Martha, in turn, had often spoken of Robert to Eleanor, lamenting his distance, but never speaking ill of him. "He's just lost," Martha had said one afternoon, as they shared tea in Eleanor's small apartment. "But I hold on to hope. Sometimes we find our way back when we least expect it." Now, as Eleanor made her way home after her shift, she thought of Martha. The woman's photograph still sat on Eleanor's worn side table, a reminder of better days and a friendship that had sustained her. Eleanor felt a pang of sorrow, not just for Martha's passing, but for the son who had never understood what he had lost. At the same time, Robert sat at his desk, staring out the window at the city below. His mind was far from the morning's events, focused instead on an invitation that had arrived on his desk that week. It was for a gala honoring his late mother's contributions to the local hospital. He had hesitated to accept, feeling little connection to the cause or the woman it celebrated. But the pressure to attend, if only for appearances, was mounting. As the day drew to a close, the lives of Robert and Eleanor remained worlds apart. Yet the threads of their stories were beginning to weave together in ways neither could foresee, setting the stage for a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The invitation to the gala sat unopened on Robert Kensington's mahogany desk for days before he finally picked it up. The thick, cream-colored envelope bore the hospital's emblem in a soft gold emboss, a nod to formality that did not appeal to Robert's sensibilities. He slid a letter opener across the edge, his movements deliberate, as though prolonging the act could somehow change what lay inside. The words were cordial, even warm, but they landed coldly in his hands. You are cordially invited to celebrate the life and contributions of Mrs. Martha Kensington. Robert leaned back in his chair, staring at the letter. It spoke of his mother's generosity and her lasting impact on the community, particularly her dedication to the hospital where she had spent so much of her later years. The gala promised speeches, tributes, and a commemorative unveiling, a spectacle meant to immortalize her work. Yet, to Robert, it felt hollow, like a distant echo of a woman he barely remembered in the way others seemed to. He drummed his fingers on the desk, debating whether to attend. His reasons, if he could call them that, were largely pragmatic. The event would be filled with influential figures, potential business partners, and donors, people who could be valuable to his ventures. To decline would be seen as callous, even disrespectful, though the thought of sitting through a night of sentimental speeches left him cold. Still, appearances mattered in his world, and so he resolved to go, if only to maintain the veneer of filial duty. As the day of the gala approached, Eleanor Mayfield sat in her small kitchen, lost in thought. The radio played softly in the background, its cheerful music at odds with the wistfulness that enveloped her. She had heard about the event through the grapevine, whispers among hospital staff and old friends of Martha Kensington. The memory of her friends surfaced like a bright thread in the fabric of her otherwise muted life. Martha had been a lifeline in the years following Daniel's death, a quiet presence that neither demanded nor judged. They had met by chance, brought together by the very institution now celebrating Martha's legacy. Eleanor had been there to donate a kidney, a decision born out of a desire to help someone, anyone, at a time when she felt powerless against her own grief. Martha had been the recipient, though neither knew it at the time. Their bond, forged in that hospital, grew over cups of tea and shared silences. But as the years passed, their lives drifted apart. Eleanor remained tethered to her modest existence, while Martha's world became increasingly filled with charitable endeavors and social engagements. There were fewer visits, though never a lack of affection. Eleanor never begrudged the distance. Martha's life was full in a way Eleanor's had not been for decades. Eleanor sighed, her thoughts interrupted by the kettle's whistle. She poured herself a cup of tea and carried it to the small table by the window, where a faded photograph of Martha smiled back at her. She traced the edge of the frame with her finger, a gesture of quiet reverence. The thought of attending the gala crossed her mind, but she dismissed it just as quickly. Such events were not for someone like her. On the night of the gala, Robert arrived fashionably late, his expression carefully neutral as he navigated the sea of well-dressed attendees. The room was adorned with tasteful decorations, white and gold accents that mirrored the invitation, and the hum of polite conversation filled the air. A large portrait of Martha hung at the center of the stage, her kind eyes and gentle smile a stark contrast to the son who stood beneath it, feeling like an imposter. As Robert scanned the room, his gaze fell on a display near the stage. It was a collection of photographs and mementos from Martha's life, snapshots of her at charity events, letters of gratitude from those she had helped, and a plaque commemorating her donation to the hospital's pediatric wing. But one photo stopped him in his tracks. It was an old black-and-white picture of his mother standing beside an elderly woman. They were smiling, their hands clasped as though sharing a private joke. Robert frowned, the woman's face vaguely familiar but elusive in his memory. Before he could dwell on it, a voice behind him broke his reverie. "That's Mrs. Mayfield," said a staff member from the hospital, gesturing to the photo. "She was a dear friend of your mother's." They shared something very special, though I'm afraid I don't know the details. Robert nodded absently, his mind turning over the name. He was certain he had encountered her recently, but the connection refused to come into focus. Shrugging it off, he moved to the bar, his interest in the evening waning. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring out at the darkened street. She had thought of Martha all evening, remembering the way her laugh could fill a room and the quiet strength that had drawn people to her. She wondered what Martha would think of her now, sweeping streets and living alone in a city that barely noticed her existence. Yet there was a quiet dignity in her solitude, a resilience born of years spent surviving what life had taken from her. Though separated by circumstances and years, the lives of Robert and Eleanor continued to circle closer, their shared history waiting patiently to be unraveled. The night ended for both in silence, yet it was a silence heavy with the promise of revelations to come. The gala wore on with all the hallmarks of such events, speeches that towed the line between heartfelt and rehearsed, polite applause from an audience more interested in their wine glasses, and an air of forced joviality. Robert Kensington, however, found himself fixated on the photograph of his mother with the woman he now knew as Mrs. Mayfield. The name continued to nag at him, as though it held a significance just beyond his grasp. As the evening concluded, Robert exited the grand hall with relief, stepping into the brisk night air. The city was quieter now, its frenetic energy subdued by the late hour. He walked a few blocks before deciding to stop for coffee, his thoughts scattered. The barista handed him a steaming cup, and he stepped outside, his free hand tucked into the pocket of his coat. It was then that he saw her again, Eleanor Mayfield, the street sweeper. She stood a few yards away, her broom propped against a wall as she adjusted the scarf around her neck. Robert froze for a moment, recognition dawning. This was the same woman from the photograph. Without intending to, his grip on the coffee cup slackened, and the dark liquid sloshed over the rim, splattering onto the sidewalk and Eleanor's coat. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" she exclaimed, startled by the sudden mess. She turned to see Robert, who stood stiffly, his expression oscillating between irritation and embarrassment. "I didn't mean to," he began, but his tone betrayed his frustration more than any genuine apology. "It's just a coat," Eleanor said briskly, brushing at the damp fabric. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. She knew exactly who he was. How could she not? He had his mother's sharp features, though his demeanor lacked the warmth she had cherished in Martha. Robert's gaze lingered on her for a moment, searching for something he couldn't quite name. "You're—" he started, then stopped himself. What could he say? That he had just seen her photograph in a tribute to his mother, that he was beginning to suspect she was more than a mere acquaintance of Martha's? "I'm late," Eleanor said, cutting through his hesitation. She picked up her broom, her movements deliberate. "Good evening, Mr. Kensington." She turned and walked away, leaving Robert standing alone on the sidewalk, the half-empty coffee cup still in his hand. The air between them had been brief but charged, and Robert felt uncharacteristically unsettled. He watched her retreating figure until she disappeared around the corner. Eleanor's heart was racing as she made her way home. She had recognized Robert the moment she saw him, though she had hoped to avoid any interaction. The encounter had stirred memories she had worked hard to keep buried, memories of Martha and the unspoken bond they had shared. She wondered if Robert would piece together the connection between them, though she doubted he cared enough to try. That night, Robert returned to his apartment, a sleek and modern space that reflected none of the warmth of his upbringing. He placed the coffee cup on the counter and walked to his study, where an unopened box of his mother's belongings sat in the corner. He had avoided the box for months, reluctant to face the remnants of a relationship he had let wither long before her death. But something about the evening, Eleanor's face, the photograph, the nagging sense of unfinished business, compelled him to open it. He knelt beside the box and lifted the lid, revealing an assortment of items: a silk scarf that still faintly carried Martha's perfume, a leather-bound journal, and a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Among the letters was an envelope with his name written in his mother's careful handwriting. His breath caught as he opened it, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The letter was dated several years earlier, written during one of the many periods of silence between them. "My dearest Robert," it began, "there are things I wish I had told you while I still had the chance. Life has a way of slipping through our fingers, and I fear I have allowed too much time to pass without sharing the truths that matter most." The letter went on to describe a profound gratitude Martha had felt towards someone who had saved her life, a friend who had made an extraordinary sacrifice. The details were vague, but one line stood out: "She gave me the gift of time, something I could never repay. I hope you will one day understand the depth of her kindness." Robert sat back on his heels, the letter resting on his lap. His mother's words echoed in his mind, their weight pressing down on him. Could the woman he had seen tonight, the street sweeper with the trembling hands, be the friend his mother had written about? And if so, what kind of sacrifice had she made? As the city settled into the quiet hours of the night, Robert's mind churned with questions. He was a man accustomed to finding answers, to solving problems with cold precision, but this felt different. The answers he sought now carried a weight he wasn't sure he was prepared to bear. And yet, he knew he couldn't ignore the threads that were beginning to unravel before him. The following evening, Robert found himself sitting in his study, the letter from his mother still on the desk before him. The words seemed to grow heavier each time he read them, as if their meaning deepened with every glance. The friend she wrote about, the one who had given her the gift of time, loomed in his thoughts. He turned the envelope over in his hands, searching for clues he had missed, but there was nothing more. His mother's handwriting, once so familiar, felt distant now, like a voice from another time. In the quiet of the room, Robert's gaze shifted to the unopened box beside his chair. It was still half full of his mother's belongings, items he hadn't yet mustered the energy to sort through. He pulled it closer and began sifting through its contents. Old photographs, a delicate lace handkerchief, a brooch with a missing stone. Each item carried its own weight of memory, though none seemed to hold the answers he sought. Near the bottom of the box, he found a bundle of medical records. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he wanted to delve into such personal details. But curiosity and a growing sense of urgency pushed him forward. As he leafed through the pages, he found a document that caught his attention, a report detailing his mother's kidney transplant. It listed a donor, identified only as E. Mayfield. Robert's breath caught. It couldn't be a coincidence. The name, now confirmed, sent his thoughts spinning. The woman he had dismissed as a mere street sweeper had given his mother a second chance at life. The revelation left him shaken, not least because of his own recent treatment of her. He remembered his curt remark that morning, the spilled coffee and the brusque way he had walked away. Shame prickled at the edges of his mind, though he pushed it aside for the moment. There was too much he still didn't understand. Driven by a need for answers, Robert decided to dig deeper. He called his assistant, instructing her to pull any information she could find about Eleanor Mayfield. It wasn't a request he would normally make. It felt intrusive, but something about the situation demanded it. His assistant hesitated briefly before agreeing, and Robert ended the call with a curt "thank you." Meanwhile, in her modest apartment, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, a blanket draped over her lap to ward off the evening chill. She held a photograph of her son, Daniel, in her hands, her thumb brushing over his face. The boyish grin in the picture was a stark contrast to the sorrow that had followed his loss. The memories of him were a bittersweet comfort, a reminder of what she had loved and what she had endured. Her thoughts drifted to Martha, as they often did in quiet moments. The two women had been so different, Martha with her grace and composure, Eleanor with her practicality and resilience. Yet they had shared a bond that went beyond words, a connection forged in hardship and gratitude. Martha had never treated Eleanor with anything less than respect, even when their lives had diverged so starkly. Eleanor wondered if Robert, her son, could ever understand that kind of connection. The sound of a knock at her door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone and rarely had visitors. Rising slowly, she made her way to the door, peering through the peephole. To her surprise, it was a young delivery boy holding a small package. She opened the door, thanked him, and took the package inside. It contained a framed photograph, one she hadn't seen in years, a picture of herself and Martha, taken not long after the transplant. The accompanying note was unsigned, but the words were unmistakable. "For everything you've given." Eleanor stared at the photograph, her emotions a jumble of surprise, nostalgia, and unease. Who could have sent it? She wondered if Robert had begun piecing things together, though she dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it came. He had seemed so distant, so uninterested in anything beyond his own world. At the same time, Robert sat in his office, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face. The report from his assistant had arrived, detailing Eleanor's life with a clarity that felt almost invasive. He learned of her years as a devoted mother, her struggles after losing her son, and her unyielding work ethic despite the hardships she faced. But it was the mention of her donation to his mother that struck him most. The report described the decision as a selfless act, made with no expectation of recognition or reward. The more he read, the heavier his guilt became. Robert, a man who had prided himself on his achievements, suddenly felt hollow in the face of Eleanor's quiet sacrifice. Her life, so far removed from his own, carried a depth he couldn't ignore. He stared out the window, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. For the first time in years, he felt an unfamiliar pull, an urge to confront the parts of himself he had long buried. As the night deepened, both Robert and Eleanor sat with their thoughts, their lives still separate but undeniably intertwined. The truths they each held waited patiently, like the slow ticking of a clock, ready to reveal themselves in their own time. The days that followed brought a restlessness to Robert Kensington's life that he could not ignore. He was a man accustomed to clear goals and calculated decisions, but Eleanor Mayfield's quiet presence, now illuminated by the truth of her past, unsettled him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. The more he thought about her, the more he felt a strange mixture of guilt and fascination. How had this woman, who had given so much, been reduced to a life of obscurity and toil? And why had he never noticed her before? Robert's curiosity soon turned into action. He hired a private investigator, a discreet professional whose work would not invite attention. "I need to understand who she is," Robert explained during their brief meeting, though he offered little detail about why. The investigator, used to such vague requests, nodded and promised to report back within the week. While Robert waited, Eleanor continued her routine, though it grew harder with each passing day. The chill of November seemed to burrow into her bones, and her hands, stiff from years of labor, trembled more frequently now. She rarely allowed herself to acknowledge her physical limitations, clinging to her broom and her independence with the same determination that had carried her through life's hardships. But even she could feel the weight of time pressing down on her, whispering that it might soon be too much to bear. At the end of her shifts, Eleanor returned to her small apartment, her solitude both a comfort and a reminder of what she had lost. She avoided looking at the overdue rent notices that had begun to pile up on the kitchen counter. The letters, stamped with red warnings, felt like accusations she could not refute. Eleanor prided herself on paying her way, even when it meant sacrifices, but this time the numbers refused to add up. The thought of losing her home, a space that held the last tangible connections to her son and to Martha, was almost too much to bear. Still, she told no one of her troubles. To Eleanor, asking for help felt like surrender, a compromise of the dignity she had worked so hard to maintain. She kept her struggles to herself, presenting a calm facade to the world, even as her health and circumstances began to unravel. For Robert, the week felt interminable. When the investigators' report finally arrived, it came with more detail than he had anticipated. The neatly typed document painted a picture of Eleanor's life that was as stark as it was moving. It described her early years, her marriage to Charles, and the birth of her son, Daniel. It outlined the tragedies that had followed, the sudden departure of her husband, the devastating loss of her son, and the years of quiet resilience that defined her afterward. The report also included information about her current situation, her work as a street sweeper, her modest apartment, and the mounting financial difficulties that threatened to uproot her once again. But it was the details of the kidney donation that struck Robert most deeply. The report confirmed what he already suspected. Eleanor had been the anonymous donor who saved his mother's life. She had made the decision selflessly, offering a part of herself to a woman who, at the time, was little more than a stranger. The enormity of her sacrifice left Robert speechless. As he sat in his office, the report spread out before him. Robert felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. It wasn't just guilt, it was something deeper, a recognition of the stark contrast between their lives. Eleanor, who had given so much, had been left with so little, while he, who had taken so much for granted, had been given every advantage. The imbalance gnawed at him, forcing him to confront truths he had long avoided. Yet, despite his growing awareness, Robert found himself paralyzed. Pride and discomfort held him back, preventing him from reaching out to Eleanor. What could he say to her that would make a difference? How could he face her after the way he had dismissed her on the street? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered. Meanwhile, Eleanor's struggles deepened. One cold evening, as she returned from her shift, she found her landlord waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He was a broad-shouldered man with a gruff demeanor, and his expression offered no comfort. "Mrs. Mayfield," he began, his tone firm but not unkind. "I've given you more time than I usually would, but I can't wait forever. You need to settle the balance by the end of the month, or I'll have no choice but to start the eviction process." Eleanor nodded, her face calm despite the storm that raged within her. "I understand," she said quietly, clutching her coat tighter around her thin frame. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside her apartment, she sank into her chair and stared at the stack of rent notices on the counter. The weight of her circumstances threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed the feelings aside, as she always had. Instead, she reached for the photograph of Daniel on the table beside her and whispered a promise she had made countless times before. "I'll figure it out. I always do." As the city outside her window continued its relentless pace, the lives of Eleanor and Robert remained on parallel paths, each burdened by their own struggles, yet unknowingly drawn closer by the threads of their shared history. The choices they would soon face loomed on the horizon, waiting to test the strength of their characters and the depth of their resolve. The investigator's report remained on Robert Kensington's desk, its edges slightly frayed from where he had thumbed through it countless times. He had read the details of Eleanor Mayfield's life over and over, as if repetition might somehow lessen the weight of its revelations. But the more he read, the more the words seemed to deepen his unease. Each line painted a picture of a woman whose strength and resilience stood in quiet defiance of the world's disregard. Late one evening, as the city settled into its nightly hum, Robert sat in his office with a glass of scotch in hand. He stared at the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of amber against the dark sky. He had built a life that, by all accounts, was enviable. Wealth, power, and influence were his to command. And yet here he was, undone by the story of a woman he barely knew. His thoughts returned to the kidney donation, an act so selfless it bordered on unimaginable. Eleanor had given his mother years of life, years that Robert had squandered in his own arrogance and indifference. The shame of it burned in his chest, yet pride kept him from seeking her out. What could he possibly say that would matter? Words, he feared, would be woefully inadequate. While Robert wrestled with his conscience, Eleanor's situation grew increasingly dire. The warning from her landlord weighed heavily on her, though she spoke of it to no one. Each morning she rose before dawn, bundled in her heavy coat, and took to the streets with her broom and dustpan. The work was grueling, especially for someone of her age and health, but she pressed on with a quiet determination. To stop, she thought, would be to surrender, and surrender was something Eleanor Mayfield did not know how to do, but her body was beginning to betray her. The sharp winter air seemed to tighten her chest, and the aches in her joints grew more pronounced with each passing day. She ignored these signs, brushing them off as the inevitable discomforts of age. Yet, deep down, she knew her strength was waning, and the thought of what might come next filled her with a quiet dread. One evening, as she returned home from her shift, Eleanor found herself unable to climb the stairs to her apartment. She stood at the base of the staircase, gripping the banister as her legs trembled beneath her. A neighbor, a young woman named Grace who lived down the hall, noticed her struggle and rushed to her side. "Mrs. Mayfield, are you all right?" Grace asked, her voice filled with concern. Eleanor managed a weak smile. "Just a little winded, dear. I'll be fine in a moment." Grace wasn't convinced. "Let me help you," she insisted, slipping an arm around Eleanor's waist. Together, they slowly made their way up the stairs, Eleanor's breaths coming in shallow gasps. Once inside her apartment, Grace helped Eleanor into her chair and brought her a glass of water. "You shouldn't be doing this alone," Grace said gently. "Is there anyone I can call? Family, maybe?" Eleanor shook her head. "No family," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just me." Grace's face softened. "Well, you've got me at least. If you need anything, just knock on my door, all right?" Eleanor nodded, grateful but reluctant to accept help. As Grace left, Eleanor sat in her chair, staring out the window at the darkened street below. The weight of her circumstances pressed down on her, yet she couldn't bring herself to ask for assistance. Pride, that stubborn guardian of her independence, refused to yield. At the same time, Robert found himself haunted by memories of his mother. He thought of her laugh, the way she used to hum while tending to her garden, and the warmth of her presence, which had always seemed so effortless. He had taken her for granted, dismissing her values as quaint and her kindness as naive. Now, in the wake of Eleanor's story, those memories carried a sharp sting of regret. One evening, unable to silence the turmoil in his mind, Robert made his way to the apartment building where Eleanor lived. He had found the address in the investigator's report, though he wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish by going there. He stood outside her door, his hand poised to knock, but the courage to follow through eluded him. The weight of his shame and the fear of rejection held him back. Inside, Eleanor sat in her chair, clutching the photograph of her son. She thought of Daniel often these days, his smile a distant but comforting memory. She wondered what he would say if he could see her now. Would he be proud of her resilience, or would he wish she had allowed herself to lean on others for once? Robert lingered outside the door for several minutes before turning away. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building. As he stepped into the cold night, he vowed to find another way to make things right, though he had no idea what that might be. The lives of Robert and Eleanor continued to orbit each other, their paths drawing ever closer. Each carried burdens they struggled to shoulder alone, unaware of how deeply their fates were entwined. The city, indifferent as ever, held its breath, waiting for the moment when their worlds would finally collide. The next morning brought with it a pale sunlight that did little to lift the spirits of those going about their business in the city. Eleanor Mayfield rose early, as always, her body aching from the demands of her work and the years that weighed heavily upon her. The brief assistance from Grace the evening before had left her both grateful and embarrassed. Eleanor was not accustomed to relying on others, and the idea of being seen as weak or incapable troubled her deeply. She made her way to the corner store for milk, walking slowly but determinedly. As she approached the checkout counter, she noticed a young man behind her holding a notepad. His presence seemed out of place, as if he wasn't there to shop, but rather to observe. Eleanor dismissed him with a quick glance, though a faint unease lingered as she left the store. Later that day, the same young man reappeared, this time near her workplace. He stood across the street, jotting notes and occasionally snapping pictures with a small camera. Eleanor frowned, unsure of his intentions but unwilling to confront him. She kept her focus on her work, sweeping leaves into neat piles and muttering quietly to herself about the foolishness of youth. The young man was a journalist named Andrew Wallace, a freelancer with a knack for uncovering human interest stories. He had recently stumbled upon the details of Eleanor's kidney donation through a conversation with a hospital staff member. Intrigued, he began piecing together her story, uncovering fragments of her life that painted a picture of quiet heroism and resilience. He had no intention of causing harm, but his curiosity and ambition drove him to dig deeper, even as he remained unaware of how exposed his inquiries might make Eleanor feel. Meanwhile, Robert Kensington sat in his office, still grappling with the weight of the investigator's report and his own inaction. His mind often wandered back to his late mother, to the countless opportunities he had missed to truly know her. Each thought was like a stone dropped into the still waters of his composure, sending ripples of regret outward. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was his assistant informing him of a visitor, Dr. Alice Brennan, a former colleague of his mother's. Surprised but curious, Robert instructed her to send the doctor in. Dr. Brennan was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She greeted Robert with a firm handshake and a warm smile before settling into the chair opposite his desk. "I hope I'm not intruding," she began, her voice steady but gentle. "I felt compelled to reach out after hearing about the gala honoring your mother." Robert inclined his head slightly. "Not at all, Dr. Brennan." "Please, go on." "I worked with your mother for many years," she continued. "She was an extraordinary woman, kind, compassionate, and utterly selfless. But I imagine you already know that." Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I knew she was dedicated to her work," he said carefully. Dr. Brennan hesitated, studying him for a moment. "There's something I think you should know," she said finally. "Your mother often spoke of a woman named Eleanor Mayfield. They were close friends, though Eleanor preferred to keep out of the spotlight. What she did for your mother, her donation, was nothing short of miraculous. Martha never stopped being grateful for it. Robert's jaw clenched as he absorbed her words. "I've recently come to understand that," he admitted, "but I fear I've already failed to honor her properly." "It's never too late to show gratitude, Doctor," Brennan replied, her tone firm but encouraging. "Eleanor is not the kind of person who seeks recognition, but that doesn't mean she doesn't deserve it." Their conversation lingered with Robert long after Dr. Brennan had left. Her words felt like a challenge, a call to action that he could no longer ignore. Yet, he struggled with the question of how to approach Eleanor, how to bridge the chasm between them without causing further harm. Across town, Andrew Wallace sat in a coffee shop, reviewing his notes and photographs. His excitement over the story was palpable. He believed it had the potential to move hearts and inspire change. But as he pieced together the narrative, he began to sense the delicate nature of Eleanor's situation, her modest lifestyle, her advanced age, and her apparent aversion to attention suggested a woman who valued her privacy above all else. Still, Andrew felt a responsibility to tell her story, to shine a light on the quiet heroism that so often went unnoticed in the noise of the world. He decided to approach her directly, hoping to gain her permission to publish the article. With his notepad tucked under his arm, he set off toward her apartment, unaware of the storm his actions might unleash. That evening, Eleanor returned home to find Andrew waiting at her door. He introduced himself politely, explaining his intentions and asking if she would be willing to share her story. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly guarded as he spoke. When he finished, she shook her head firmly. "I'm sorry, young man, but my life isn't a story for the papers," she said. "Whatever you've heard, let it stay in the past where it belongs." Andrew nodded, sensing the finality in her tone. "I understand," he said, though disappointment flickered in his eyes. "Thank you for your time." As he walked away, Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her heart heavy. She had spent years trying to live quietly, to avoid the gaze of a world that often judged without understanding. The thought of her private sacrifices being exposed filled her with unease, though she couldn't quite articulate why. In that moment, the lives of Eleanor, Robert, and Andrew intersected in ways none of them fully understood. The threads of their stories, woven so tightly together, continued to pull them toward a reckoning that would change them all. Robert Kensington's office had always been a place of focus, a sanctuary where decisions were made with precision and purpose. Yet now, it felt oppressive, filled with the weight of his thoughts. He sat at his desk, his hands clasped tightly, as he stared at the investigator's report for what felt like the 100th time. The words blurred together, their meaning already ingrained in his mind. Eleanor Mayfield's life, so vastly different from his own, had become a mirror reflecting his failures, not just as a son, but as a man. The conversation with Dr. Alice Brennan lingered in his thoughts, her words piercing through his carefully constructed defenses. "It's never too late to show gratitude," she had said. But gratitude, Robert realized, was not a simple thing to express when it came laden with years of neglect and arrogance. He wondered if his mother had ever truly forgiven him for his indifference, and if Eleanor, who had given so much to a woman he had taken for granted, could ever forgive him now. As these thoughts churned in his mind, Robert felt an unfamiliar pull, a need to confront the ghosts of his past and the truths he had avoided for so long. He rose from his desk, grabbed his coat, and made his way to the car. His destination was Eleanor's apartment, the address etched into his memory from the investigator's report. The drive through the city was slow, the streets choked with evening traffic. The radio played softly in the background, though Robert paid little attention to the music. His thoughts were consumed by what he might say to Eleanor, how he could possibly bridge the chasm that separated them. By the time he reached her building, the sky had darkened and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Robert stood at the base of the steps, staring up at the modest structure. It was a far cry from the luxury he was accustomed to, yet it held a quiet dignity, much like the woman who lived within. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy with uncertainty. When he reached her door, he hesitated, his hand hovering just above the wood. The thought of facing her, of acknowledging the depth of her sacrifice and his own shortcomings, felt almost insurmountable. Inside, Eleanor sat in her chair, her hands folded in her lap as she stared at the photograph of her son. The earlier encounter with Andrew Wallace had left her unsettled, though she had done her best to push it from her mind. The thought of her life being turned into a public story, stripped of its privacy and dignity, was unbearable. She had always lived quietly, finding solace in the small acts of kindness she offered to others. To be thrust into the spotlight, even briefly, felt like a betrayal of everything she held dear. A sudden knock at the door broke through her thoughts, startling her. She rose slowly, her movements careful, and made her way to the door. When she peered through the peephole, her heart skipped a beat. Standing on the other side was Robert Kensington, his expression unreadable. Eleanor hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. She debated not answering, pretending she wasn't home, but something in Robert's face stopped her. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and opened the door, her gaze meeting his. "Mrs. Mayfield," Robert began, his voice quieter than she expected. "May I come in? I'd like to speak with you." Eleanor's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "What is it you want, Mr. Kensington?" she asked, her tone wary. Robert shifted uncomfortably. I want to apologize," he said finally, "for the way I spoke to you, and for so much more. I've come to understand things about you that I should have known long ago." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her silence stretching between them. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Robert stepped inside, his presence filling the small apartment in a way that felt almost intrusive. He glanced around, taking in the modest furnishings, the carefully arranged photographs, and the faint smell of lavender that lingered in the air. Eleanor gestured for him to sit, and he did, perching awkwardly on the edge of the chair across from her. She returned to her own chair, her posture straight and her gaze steady. "Well," she prompted, her voice calm but firm, "what is it you've come to say?" Robert took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've recently learned about what you did for my mother," he began. "The sacrifice you made. It's extraordinary. And I've come to realize how deeply I've failed to honor that. I never took the time to understand the people who mattered most to her, or to acknowledge the kindness that saved her life." Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained up. "I didn't do it for recognition, Mr. Kensington," she said. "And I certainly didn't do it for you." "I know," Robert said quickly. "That's what makes it all the more remarkable. But I also know that my mother held you in the highest regard, and I want to do right by her memory, and by you." The sincerity in his voice surprised Eleanor, though she wasn't ready to lower her defenses entirely. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her tone cautious. Robert hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted, "but I want to help. Whatever you need, whatever I can do to ease the burdens you've carried for so long." Eleanor's gaze softened further, though a faint sadness lingered in her eyes. "You can't erase the past, Mr. Kensington," she said gently, "but perhaps there's a way forward." Their conversation hung in the air, tentative and fragile, like the first steps of a journey neither of them fully understood. The morning air was heavy with the smell of damp pavement as Eleanor walked slowly to her usual spot on the street. The weight of her conversation with Robert lingered in her thoughts, casting a shadow over the routine tasks that usually brought her a sense of calm. His visit the previous evening had stirred emotions she had worked hard to keep buried, gratitude for his attempt to reach out, but also skepticism about his true intentions. Eleanor swept the sidewalk with deliberate motions, her hands gripping the broom tighter than usual. Around her, the city bustled with its typical indifference. Commuters rushed past, cars honked in the distance, and the faint hum of conversation filled the air. She focused on the rhythmic sweep of her broom, trying to ground herself in the familiar, but her solitude was disrupted when she noticed a small crowd gathering at the edge of the block. Murmurs rippled through the group, and soon she realized the cause of their interest. A young journalist, Andrew Wallace, had published an article about her. The headline, bold and uncomfortably personal, read, "The Unsung Hero Who Gave Everything, Eleanor Mayfield's Story of Sacrifice." Eleanor's heart sank as she read the words on a discarded copy of the newspaper someone had dropped on the ground. Her story, once private and known only to a select few, was now laid bare for the world to see. The article painted her as a figure of quiet heroism, detailing her donation to Martha Kensington and the hardships she had endured since. It spoke glowingly of her resilience and kindness, but to Eleanor it felt like an intrusion, a violation of the life she had carefully guarded. People began to approach her, their faces filled with curiosity and, in some cases, admiration. "Mrs. Mayfield, is it true?" one woman asked, her voice tinged with awe. "You gave a kidney to save that Kensington woman." Eleanor's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She muttered a polite response, brushing off the attention as best she could. But the crowd lingered. Questions came from all sides, each one chipping away at the anonymity she cherished. She longed to retreat, to disappear into the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, but the stares and whispers followed her, even as she finished her shift and made her way home. By the time she reached her door, she felt drained, her usual strength eroded by the weight of unwanted attention. She slumped into her chair, her hands trembling as she unfolded the newspaper she had brought with her. The article, though well-meaning, felt like a betrayal of the life she had chosen to lead. It exposed parts of her story she had never intended to share, turning her private sacrifices into public spectacle. Meanwhile, Robert Kensington sat in his office, staring at a copy of the same newspaper. The article had not gone unnoticed by the business community, and his phone had been ringing all morning with calls from colleagues, journalists, and even acquaintances from his past. Most of them were curious about his reaction to the piece, while others offered thinly veiled criticisms of his apparent neglect toward the woman who had saved his mother's life. The shame that had been simmering within Robert now boiled over into frustration, not just with himself, but with the world's sudden interest in Eleanor's story. He knew that the article, while praising her, had also exposed her to a level of scrutiny she had not sought or deserved. He felt responsible, even though he had not been the one to reveal her story. Unable to ignore the situation any longer, Robert picked up his phone and called Eleanor. It rang several times before she answered, her voice wary. "Mrs. Mayfield, it's Robert Kensington," he said, his tone subdued. "I imagine you've seen the article." "I have," Eleanor replied, her voice clipped. "And I'd like to know who gave that young man the right to tell my story." "I don't know," Robert admitted, though he suspected Andrew Wallace's sources were closer to the hospital than to him. "But I want to help. If there's anything I can do to make this right—" "You can't," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm. "What's done is done. I'll deal with it in my own way." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving Robert feeling both helpless and determined. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his mother's legacy pressing heavily on his shoulders. For years, he had dismissed the values she had held dear: compassion, humility, and gratitude. Now, those same values seemed to be slipping through his fingers, just as they had during her lifetime. That evening, as Eleanor sat by her window, staring out at the street below, she reflected on the whirlwind of the day. The attention, though well-meaning, felt like a burden she hadn't asked for. She thought of Martha and the quiet friendship they had shared. Martha had always understood her desire for privacy, never prying, never demanding more than Eleanor was willing to give. The thought of Martha's son, so different yet trying in his own way, left her with conflicting emotions. As the city settled into the quiet rhythms of night, both Eleanor and Robert found themselves facing the same question: how to move forward from a past that refused to stay hidden. For Eleanor, the path was uncertain, but she resolved to face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through so many trials before. For Robert, the path demanded a reckoning, not just with Eleanor, but with himself. The following morning, the streets were abuzz with murmurs of the article that had cast Eleanor Mayfield into an unwelcome spotlight. Her story, which she had guarded so carefully, had taken on a life of its own, whispered about in coffee shops and passed from one curious stranger to another. Eleanor, however, walked with her head down, the brim of her worn hat casting a shadow over her weary face. She kept her focus on her work, though each passerby's lingering glance felt like a fresh wound. By midday, the intrusion became too much to bear. Reporters began to gather near her usual sweeping route, their cameras slung over shoulders and their notebooks poised for quotes. Eleanor tried to ignore them, but the sound of their questions cut through the air like jagged glass. "Mrs. Mayfield, how does it feel to be called a hero?" one journalist asked. "Do you have any regrets about your donation?" another pressed. Eleanor stopped sweeping, her hands tightening around the broom handle. She turned slowly, her face calm but her voice firm. "I've said all I intend to say. Please, leave me be." Her words carried a dignity that silenced the crowd for a moment, but their curiosity was insatiable. They stayed, circling her like crows around a wounded animal. It wasn't long before Eleanor's composure began to crack. Her hands trembled and her breath came in shallow bursts. She dropped the broom and walked away, her steps uneven as she disappeared down an alley. By the time Eleanor reached her apartment, her chest was tight and her legs felt unsteady beneath her. She leaned against the doorframe, willing herself to calm down before stepping inside. The apartment, her sanctuary, now felt smaller and more fragile than ever. She lowered herself into her chair and stared at the photograph of Daniel on the table beside her. His smile, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock the chaos surrounding her. At the same time, Robert Kensington was grappling with his own reckoning. The fallout from the article had reached his office, with colleagues and board members raising eyebrows at the connection between his family's wealth and the woman who had quietly saved his mother's life. Whispers of his perceived neglect followed him like a shadow, their sting exacerbated by his own mounting guilt. Emma, a young intern at Robert's company, was among the few who dared to speak openly about the situation. She had always admired Eleanor, having once seen her sweeping outside the office building and been struck by the woman's quiet determination. Now, with the story out in the open, Emma felt compelled to act. She approached Robert one afternoon, her youthful energy a stark contrast to the weariness etched into his features. "Mr. Kensington," she began hesitantly, "may I have a word?" Robert nodded, motioning for her to sit. Emma hesitated before continuing, her voice steady but impassioned. "I've been following Mrs. Mayfield's story. She's remarkable. I think you have an opportunity to honor her in a way that goes beyond words." Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And how do you propose I do that, Emma?" "You're in a position to make a real difference," she said earnestly. "Your mother's legacy and Eleanor's sacrifices deserve more than just acknowledgement." You could create something lasting, something that reflects the values they both stood for. Her words struck a chord, though Robert was careful not to show it. He nodded thoughtfully, thanking her for her insight, before dismissing her. But as the hours passed, Emma's suggestion took root in his mind. It wasn't enough to apologize or offer financial assistance. He needed to find a way to honor both his mother and Eleanor in a manner that would carry forward their shared spirit of generosity. Meanwhile, Eleanor's day grew darker. By late afternoon, the reporters had followed her to her building, their voices rising as they called for her to come outside. She pulled the curtains tight, her body tense with frustration and fatigue. For years, she had endured life's trials with quiet dignity. But this relentless invasion of her privacy threatened to undo her. Finally, she made a decision. She picked up the phone and dialed Robert's number, her hands shaking as she waited for him to answer. When he did, she wasted no time with pleasantries. "Mr. Kensington," she said, her voice sharp with exhaustion. "I need this to stop. These reporters, this attention, it's unbearable." Robert's tone softened. "I understand, Mrs. Mayfield. I'll do everything I can to help." "You say that," she replied, her voice faltering. "But do you truly understand what it's like to have your life turned upside down? I never wanted recognition. I only wanted to live quietly." "I know," Robert said quietly, "and I'm sorry. I'll find a way to make this right." Eleanor ended the call without another word, her strength spent. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes against the ache in her chest. The world outside her window carried on as if nothing had changed. But for Eleanor, everything felt unmoored. As night fell, both Eleanor and Robert found themselves staring into the darkness, each grappling with the weight of their choices and the paths that had brought them to this moment. The city, indifferent as always, stood as a silent witness to their struggles, waiting for the next chapter of their intertwined stories to unfold. The tension in Eleanor Mayfield's apartment was palpable as she sat by the window, her curtains drawn tightly to shield her from the persistent crowd of reporters still gathered on the street below. She had hoped for peace after her call to Robert Kensington, but the noise outside told her otherwise. It seemed her quiet life, so carefully maintained for years, was now beyond her control. As she sat, trying to focus on the faint hum of her old radio, a knock sounded at her door. Her body stiffened, the sound filling her with both dread and a flicker of hope that it might be someone with good intentions. Rising slowly, she peered through the peephole and was relieved to see Grace, her young neighbor who had helped her before. "Mrs. Mayfield," Grace said gently as Eleanor opened the door, "I thought you might need some company. I brought tea." She held up a small thermos and a package of cookies, her smile kind and reassuring. Eleanor nodded, stepping aside to let Grace in. "Thank you, dear. It's been a day." The two women settled at the small kitchen table, Grace pouring the tea, while Eleanor watched her with a mixture of gratitude and weariness. "I saw the article," Grace began cautiously. "I can't imagine how overwhelming this must be for you." Eleanor sighed, her hands cradling the warm cup. "It's not just overwhelming, Grace. It's wrong. I've lived my life trying to avoid this kind of attention. What good does it do? Parading my story like it's a spectacle." Grace hesitated, her brow furrowing. "I think people are inspired by what you've done. Maybe they see something in your story that gives them hope." Eleanor shook her head. "They don't know the whole story. They see the sacrifice, but not the pain that came with it, or the life I've had to rebuild since." Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor of emotion beneath her words. Meanwhile, across the city, Robert Kensington stood in his office, staring out at the skyline. The conversation with Eleanor earlier that day had stayed with him, her exhaustion and frustration ringing in his ears. He knew that his efforts to help had fallen short, But Emma's words from the day before also echoed in his mind. You're in a position to make a real difference. It was then that Robert made a decision. He picked up his phone and called Emma to his office. When she arrived, she looked at him expectantly, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Emma," Robert began, his tone more deliberate than usual, "you were right. Words and apologies aren't enough. I need to do more for Eleanor, for my mother, and for others like them." Emma's face brightened with a mixture of relief and excitement. "I think that's a great idea, Mr. Kensington. What did you have in mind?" Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "I want to start a foundation," he said, "something that honors my mother's memory and the sacrifices Eleanor has made. It will focus on providing support for people like her, those who've quietly given so much without recognition or resources to fall back on." Emma's eyes widened. "That could make a real difference," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. "But do you think Eleanor will accept it? She seems very private." "I don't know," Robert admitted, "but I have to try. It's the least I can do." As the day turned to evening, Robert instructed his staff to begin laying the groundwork for the foundation. He wanted it to be more than a gesture. It had to be something lasting, something meaningful. His mother's name and Eleanor's would be at its heart, tied together in a way that reflected their shared values. Back at her apartment, Eleanor and Grace continued their conversation. Grace listened attentively as Eleanor spoke of her years working as a street sweeper, the quiet life she had built after losing her son, and the unexpected friendship she had shared with Martha Kensington. Though Eleanor's tone was calm, her words carried the weight of a life shaped by both love and loss. "You know," Grace said softly, "you've lived through so much, Mrs. Mayfield. Maybe this attention is a way for people to see the goodness in the world, even if it came at a cost to you." Eleanor considered Grace's words, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her tea. "Perhaps," she said finally, "but it doesn't change how much I've lost along the way." As the night grew darker, the reporters outside finally began to disperse, leaving Eleanor with a rare moment of quiet. She walked Grace to the door, thanking her for the visit and the kindness that had softened the day's sharp edges. After Grace left, Eleanor sat by the window once more, her thoughts heavy. The world outside seemed quieter now, but the turmoil within her remained. She wondered what would come next, whether she would find a way to reclaim the peace she had worked so hard to protect. In his own apartment, Robert sat at his desk, staring at the first draft of the Foundation's mission statement. The words felt inadequate, but they were a start. He thought of his mother, of the values she had tried to instill in him, and of Eleanor, who had embodied those values more fully than he ever had. For both Eleanor and Robert, the night was filled with questions and the faint glimmer of something new, a sense that the paths they had walked separately for so long might finally begin to converge in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Eleanor Mayfield awoke early the next morning to a soft, grey light filtering through her curtains. The air in her apartment was chilly, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she shuffled to the kitchen to prepare a simple breakfast. Despite the quiet around her, a sense of unease lingered, an echo of the chaos that had erupted in the days before. The reporters were gone for now, but their presence had left her unsettled, and the weight of their intrusion still pressed heavily on her mind. As she sat at her small table, sipping her tea, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor frowned, hesitant to answer, but curiosity got the better of her. When she opened the door, she found a neatly dressed courier holding an envelope with her name written in elegant script. "Good morning, ma'am," the courier said politely. "This is for you." Eleanor accepted the envelope with a cautious nod and closed the door behind her. She opened it slowly, her hands steady despite the flicker of apprehension she felt. Inside was a letter, neatly typed on thick, cream-colored paper. The header bore the name Kensington Mayfield Foundation, followed by a formal introduction explaining the organization's purpose: to provide support and resources to individuals who, like Eleanor, had made extraordinary sacrifices for the benefit of others. Eleanor's brow furrowed as she read on. The letter outlined plans for a public announcement and gala to inaugurate the foundation, and she was named as its honorary figurehead. Her name, alongside Martha Kensington's, would be at the heart of the foundation's mission, a tribute to their shared values of generosity and quiet heroism. Her initial reaction was one of disbelief. She set the letter down, staring at it as if it might vanish before her eyes. The idea of being so publicly honored felt overwhelming, even intrusive. She had lived a life of humility and hard work, and the thought of being thrust into the spotlight again filled her with unease. Yet, as she considered the possibilities, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. Could this foundation, born out of her story and Martha's legacy, bring something good to others? Later that morning, Eleanor called Robert Kensington, her voice measured but tinged with curiosity. "Mr. Kensington," she began, "I've received your letter. I'd like to understand more about this foundation you've created." Robert, who had been sitting at his desk reviewing the same letter, leaned back in his chair, relieved to hear from her. "Thank you for calling, Mrs. Mayfield," he said, his tone earnest. "The foundation is something I've been working on for the past few days. It's a way to honor both my mother's memory and your incredible sacrifices. But it's more than that. It's a way to help others who find themselves in situations like yours." Eleanor was silent for a moment, her thoughts racing. "And what exactly do you expect from me, Mr. Kensington?" she asked. "I'm not one for public appearances or grand gestures." "I understand," Robert replied quickly. "You're not obligated to do anything you're uncomfortable with. Your name is on the foundation because you've inspired it, but the work itself will focus on supporting others. If you'd prefer to stay in the background, that's entirely your choice." Eleanor considered his words carefully. While the idea of being publicly associated with the foundation still made her uneasy, she couldn't deny the potential for good that it represented. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But I make no promises." "That's all I can ask," Robert said. "Thank you, Mrs. Mayfield." As the call ended, both Eleanor and Robert felt a cautious sense of progress. For Eleanor, the foundation represented a chance to turn her unwanted notoriety into something meaningful, though she remained wary of the attention it might bring. For Robert, it was a step toward redemption, a way to honor the values he had long ignored but now sought to embrace. Later that day, Robert gathered his team to finalize the plans for the foundation's announcement. Emma, whose enthusiasm had been a driving force behind the project, presented ideas for the event, from its location to the key speakers. She suggested a modest venue that reflected the foundation's mission of humility and service, rather than the grandeur typically associated with the Kensington name. As the team discussed the details, Robert found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The man who had once dismissed his mother's philanthropy as sentimental now felt a deep sense of responsibility to continue her work. He knew that the foundation alone would not absolve him of his past failings, but it was a start, a way to honor the lessons he had learned from both his mother and Eleanor. That evening, as Eleanor walked home from a brief trip to the corner store, she passed a small group of people gathered outside a community center. They were discussing the article about her, their voices filled with admiration for her sacrifices. One woman, holding a young child, said softly, "It's people like her who remind us there's still kindness in the world." Eleanor paused, her heart catching at the woman's words. She had never sought recognition, Yet hearing how her actions had inspired others stirred something within her. Perhaps this foundation, this work that bore her name, could bring light to lives that had known only struggle. As she entered her apartment, the letter from the foundation still resting on her table, Eleanor felt a tentative resolve growing within her. While the path ahead was uncertain, she began to wonder if her quiet life could make room for something more, a legacy of hope and service that might carry forward long after her story was forgotten. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Eleanor Mayfield. She spent her mornings sweeping the streets as usual, her broom moving in steady, deliberate strokes, while her mind wrestled with the decisions before her. The letter from the Kensington Mayfield Foundation lay on her table at home, its neatly typed words both a source of hope and a cause for apprehension. She had told Robert she would think about it, but the idea of stepping into the public eye again filled her with dread. Meanwhile, the city seemed to buzz with news of the foundation. Local papers published glowing articles about its mission, highlighting Eleanor's story as an inspiration. Yet for all the praise, she felt no closer to peace. Instead, the attention only deepened her sense of displacement, as if the life she had worked so hard to build was slipping through her fingers. One cold afternoon, as she finished her shift and prepared to head home, a man approached her. He was well-dressed but unassuming, his manner polite but purposeful. "Mrs. Mayfield?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, her tone wary. "My name is Gregory, and I work with Mr. Kensington. He asked me to deliver this personally." He handed her a small box, neatly wrapped in plain brown paper. "He thought it might help with your decision." Eleanor took the box, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. "Thank you," she said, though her voice carried more curiosity than gratitude. She tucked the box under her arm and continued on her way, eager to examine it in the quiet of her apartment. When she finally unwrapped it that evening, she found a framed photograph inside. It was an old picture of Martha Kensington and Eleanor, taken years earlier during one of Martha's visits. The image was simple but poignant. Two women sitting side by side, their expressions warm and unguarded. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note from Robert. "For the friendship that changed my mother's life. Thank you." Eleanor stared at the photograph for a long time, her emotions a complex tangle of nostalgia and uncertainty. She remembered the day it was taken, the way Martha had insisted on capturing the moment despite Eleanor's protests. "One day, you'll look back and be glad we did this," Martha had said with a laugh. And now, all these years later, those words felt both prophetic and bittersweet. The next morning, Eleanor called Robert again. Her voice was steady, but carried a note of resolve. "Mr. Kensington, I've received your gift. It was thoughtful." "I'm glad you think so," Robert replied, his tone cautious. "Does this mean you've made a decision?" "I'm still considering it," Eleanor admitted, "but I'd like to meet with you, somewhere quiet, away from all the noise. There are things I need to understand before I agree to anything." "Of course," Robert said immediately. "Tell me where and when, and I'll be there." They agreed to meet that evening at a small park not far from Eleanor's apartment. The air was crisp and cold as she arrived, the bare trees casting long shadows across the ground. Robert was already there, seated on a bench with his hands clasped in front of him. He rose as she approached, his expression earnest. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, motioning for her to sit. Eleanor took a seat, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "Mr. Kensington," she began finally, "I appreciate what you're trying to do. This foundation, the work you've described, It could help a lot of people, but I need to know why you're doing this. Is it truly about honoring your mother and helping others? Or is it about easing your own conscience? Robert's face tightened, but he didn't shy away from her question. If I'm being honest, Mrs. Mayfield, it's both, he admitted. I've spent much of my life focused on success and status, neglecting the values my mother held dear. This foundation is a way to correct that, to honor her memory and the sacrifices you made for her. But it's also a way for me to make amends for my own failings. Eleanor studied him, her sharp eyes searching his face for any trace of insincerity. You've made mistakes, she said finally. We all have. But redemption doesn't come from grand gestures alone. It comes from living differently, from changing the way you see and treat the world. I know, Robert said quietly, and I'm trying. This foundation is just the beginning. Eleanor nodded, her expression softening slightly. I'll consider being part of this, but on my terms. I won't be a figurehead for publicity or a symbol for people to gawk at. If I agree, it's because I believe in the work, not because I want recognition. Understood, Robert said, his voice firm with gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Mayfield. That's more than I could have hoped for. As they parted ways, Eleanor felt a faint flicker of hope, both for the foundation and for Robert's ability to honor the legacy of the woman they had both loved. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like the beginning of something meaningful. The days after Eleanor's meeting with Robert were a delicate balancing act. She returned to her work on the streets, her broom sweeping the cold pavement as she tried to find some semblance of normalcy. Yet, the knowledge of the Foundation's looming launch and her potential involvement weighed on her, pulling her thoughts in countless directions. It was a decision she didn't take lightly, for it carried consequences far beyond her own life. Robert, meanwhile, found himself engrossed in preparations for the Foundation's official unveiling. He worked tirelessly, ensuring that every detail reflected the sincerity of its mission. He instructed his staff to avoid extravagance, insisting that the event be modest and focused on the people it aimed to help. He envisioned an event that not only honored his mother and Eleanor, but also provided a platform to highlight the stories of others who had given selflessly in the shadows. Amid the flurry of activity, Robert couldn't ignore the lingering uncertainty surrounding Eleanor's participation. She had agreed to consider being part of the Foundation, but remained non-committal. The thought of her absence weighed heavily on him, for it was her story that had inspired this endeavor. Without her, the Foundation's mission felt incomplete. One evening, as Robert sat in his office reviewing final plans for the launch, Emma knocked softly on the door. She stepped inside, her expression a mixture of excitement and hesitation. "Mr. Kensington, I've been working on the guest list," she began. "There's a lot of interest, especially from people who admire Mrs. Mayfield's story. But I wanted to make sure we're respecting her wishes." Robert nodded, setting down the papers in his hand. "What do you suggest?" "Maybe we should talk to her again," Emma said. "Let her know exactly what to expect and give her the space to decide how involved she wants to be. She's the heart of this Foundation, but it has to be on her terms." Robert leaned back in his chair, her words striking a chord. "You're right," he said. "I'll reach out to her tomorrow." True to his word, Robert called Eleanor the next morning. The conversation was brief but earnest. He explained the plans for the launch, emphasizing that her involvement was entirely her choice. Eleanor listened, her voice calm but non-committal as she thanked him for keeping her informed. After the call, Eleanor sat in her chair, staring out the window at the bare trees swaying in the winter wind. She thought of the Foundation's potential, the lives it could touch, the hope it could bring. Yet, the idea of being at the center of it all still made her uneasy. She had spent so much of her life avoiding attention, finding solace in her quiet acts of kindness. To step into the spotlight now felt like a betrayal of the principles that had guided her for so long. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself drawn to the photograph Robert had sent her. She picked it up, running her fingers along the edges of the frame. The image of herself and Martha sitting side by side with smiles that spoke of genuine friendship stirred something deep within her. It reminded her of the bond they had shared, the quiet understanding that had required no words. In the days that followed, Eleanor noticed a change in the people around her. Neighbors she had barely spoken to before stopped to greet her warmly, their faces lit with admiration. Grace, her young neighbor, visited often, bringing small comforts like tea and baked goods. Even the people she passed on the street seemed to regard her with newfound respect. Yet for all the kindness, Eleanor felt a quiet longing for the simplicity she had lost. One afternoon, as she swept the streets near her building, she saw a woman standing nearby, holding a child's hand. The woman approached cautiously, her expression tentative. "Mrs. Mayfield," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did for the Kensington family and for everything you've endured. People like you remind us that there's still goodness in the world." Eleanor looked at the woman, her usual reserve softening. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both humility and gratitude. The interaction, brief as it was, stayed with her as she finished her shift and returned home. That evening, Eleanor called Robert once more. Her voice was steady, though her words carried the weight of her deliberation. "Mr. Kensington," she said, "I've thought about the foundation. I'll attend the launch, but I want to keep my role modest. I'll be there to support the cause, not to be its centerpiece." Robert's relief was palpable, even over the phone. "Thank you, Mrs. Mayfield," he said. "Your presence means more than you know." As the call ended, both Eleanor and Robert felt a sense of resolution. For Eleanor, the decision to attend was a small but significant step toward embracing a new chapter in her life. For Robert, it was a chance to honor the legacy of two women who had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. In the quiet of her apartment, Eleanor placed the photograph of herself and Martha back on the table. The decision to step forward, even cautiously, felt like a tribute not only to her friend, but to the values they had shared, a belief in the power of kindness and the quiet strength of those who give without expecting anything in return. The day of the foundation's launch arrived, cloaked in the grey skies of an early winter morning. The air was heavy with anticipation as staff bustled around the modest venue, ensuring every detail was in place. Inside, the space was simple yet inviting, adorned with photographs of individuals whose quiet sacrifices mirrored Eleanor's story. Tables held displays of handwritten letters and testimonials from families whose lives had been transformed by acts of kindness. This was no grand gala, but a sincere homage to the values the foundation sought to uphold. Eleanor arrived early, her heart a mix of apprehension and resolve. She wore a simple navy dress, one she had reserved for special occasions, but rarely had cause to wear. As she stepped into the venue, she paused, taking in the scene before her. The hum of quiet conversations filled the air, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the soft shuffle of footsteps. She felt a wave of uncertainty. What place did she have here, in a room full of people who now saw her as something she never aspired to be? Robert Kensington noticed her arrival and quickly crossed the room to greet her. He wore a tailored suit, though his demeanor was uncharacteristically humble. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said warmly, extending his hand, "I'm so glad you came." Eleanor nodded, her expression reserved. "I said I would," she replied. "But I still don't know if this is where I belong." "You belong here more than anyone," Robert said, his voice sincere. "This foundation exists because of you." Before she could respond, a young woman approached them, carrying a clipboard and wearing an earnest smile. "Mr. Kensington, we're ready to begin. The guests are seated." Robert turned back to Eleanor, his expression slightly apprehensive. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The two made their way to the front of the room, where rows of chairs were filled with people from all walks of life. Some were community leaders, others were families who had benefited from similar acts of kindness, and many were strangers who had been inspired by the story that had brought them all together. As the room quieted, Robert stepped forward to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "thank you for being here today. This foundation is more than an organization. It's a testament to the power of generosity, humility, and quiet heroism. It's named for two extraordinary women, my mother, Martha Kensington, whose unwavering compassion shaped my understanding of the world, and Mrs. Eleanor Mayfield, whose selfless act gave my mother a second chance at life." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Eleanor. Mrs. Mayfield never sought recognition, and yet her story has touched countless lives. Today, we honor not only her, but all those who give without expecting anything in return. The audience erupted into applause, their faces alight with admiration. Eleanor, seated near the front, felt her cheeks flush as she looked down at her hands, unsure of how to respond. She had agreed to attend, but had not expected to be the focus of so much attention. As the applause quieted, Robert continued, "This foundation will support those who, like Mrs. Mayfield, have given of themselves to help others. It will provide resources, recognition, and community for those whose sacrifices often go unnoticed. We hope to inspire a ripple effect of kindness that extends far beyond this room." The event proceeded with a series of speeches, each one highlighting the stories of individuals whose lives had been shaped by acts of selflessness. Eleanor listened intently, her initial discomfort giving way to a sense of quiet pride. These were stories she could relate to, lives that mirrored her own in ways she had not anticipated. At the end of the program, Robert approached her again. "Would you be willing to say a few words?" he asked, his tone gentle. Eleanor hesitated, the weight of the request pressing on her. But as she looked around the room, at the faces of people who had been moved by her story, she felt a stirring of something deeper, an obligation, perhaps, to speak for those who had no voice. She stood slowly, the room falling silent as she made her way to the podium. She gripped the edges of the lectern, her hands steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "Thank you," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not used to speaking in front of so many people, and I never imagined I'd be standing here today. My life has been a simple one, filled with both joys and hardships. I've done what I could to help others, not because I sought recognition, but because it felt like the right thing to do." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "This foundation is not about me. It's about all of us. The small acts of kindness, the sacrifices made in quiet corners of the world, and the belief that we are all connected. If my story has inspired even one person to see the value in helping another, then it has been worth it." The room erupted into applause once more, but Eleanor remained composed. She stepped down from the podium and returned to her seat, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging, not as a symbol, but as part of a larger community bound by shared values. As the event concluded, Eleanor and Robert shared a quiet moment near the back of the room. "You spoke beautifully," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her tone softer than before. "And thank you for making this possible." In that moment, they both understood that the foundation was not just a tribute to the past, but a promise for the future, a commitment to honor the sacrifices of those who had come before and to inspire those who would follow. The evening of the foundation's launch lingered in Eleanor's mind long after she returned to her modest apartment. The applause, the faces of strangers filled with gratitude, and even her own words at the podium seemed distant, like fragments of someone else's life. She placed the program from the event on the corner of her table, staring at it as though it might dissolve into the air. The experience had been overwhelming, and yet, for the first time in a long while, she felt as though her life had touched something larger than herself. In the days that followed, Eleanor returned to her quiet routine. The streets she swept felt unchanged, though she noticed the occasional nod of recognition from passers-by. Some smiled warmly, others stopped briefly to offer kind words. But Eleanor kept her replies brief, her humility guarding her from their praise. She wasn't sure what to make of this new chapter in her life, and she clung to the simplicity of her work as an anchor. Meanwhile, Robert Kensington found himself grappling with emotions he hadn't anticipated. The success of the Foundation's launch brought a flood of attention, not just to Eleanor's story, but to his role in creating an organization that honored his mother's legacy. Newspapers and online outlets praised his transformation, painting him as a man who had turned from self-interest to philanthropy. Yet, Robert felt an unease that no amount of accolades could ease. He couldn't shake the feeling that his efforts, while sincere, were incomplete. It was a late afternoon when Robert made his way to Eleanor's apartment, unannounced. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of snow, as he climbed the narrow staircase to her door. He knocked twice, his hand hesitating before the second rap. From inside, he heard the faint sound of shuffling, followed by the click of the lock. When Eleanor opened the door, her expression was one of mild surprise. "Mr. Kensington," she said, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to see you," Robert replied, his tone quieter than usual. "May I come in?" Eleanor stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The apartment was as modest as he remembered, its warmth coming not from any extravagance, but from the careful way it was kept, a home that reflected the woman who lived in it. "Please, sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to the small chair across from hers. She poured 2 cups of tea without asking, setting one before Robert as she sat down. "What's on your mind?" Robert stared into the steaming cup for a moment before speaking. "The Foundation's launch, it went well, better than I could have hoped, but something about it has been troubling me." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "And what is that?" "It's this idea that I've somehow redeemed myself," Robert admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "People keep telling me how much I've changed, how much good I'm doing now. But I still feel as though I've failed my mother, and maybe even failed you." Eleanor set her cup down carefully. "Why do you feel that way?" Robert hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I waited too long. I spent years dismissing my mother's values, focusing on success and ignoring what truly mattered. And when it comes to you, Mrs. Mayfield, I didn't treat you with the respect you deserved, not at first." Eleanor regarded him thoughtfully, her expression softening. "We all have regrets, Mr. Kensington," she said quietly. "But regrets are only useful if they teach us something. What matters is what you do with the time you have now." Her words hung in the air, their simplicity striking Robert in a way that no grand speech ever had. He nodded slowly, his shoulders easing as though a weight had shifted. "You're right," he said. "I suppose I've been too focused on what I can't change, instead of what I can." For a moment, they sat in silence, the faint sound of the wind outside filling the room. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer. Your mother was a kind woman. She believed in you, even when you didn't see it. She always said that people find their way back when they're ready." Robert's throat tightened at her words. "I hope I'm finally finding mine," he said. Eleanor offered a faint smile, her eyes glimmering with something between understanding and forgiveness. It's never too late to do the right thing. As the evening light faded, Robert rose to leave. He paused at the door, turning back to face Eleanor. "Thank you, Mrs. Mayfield, for everything." Eleanor nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Take care, Mr. Kensington." As the door closed behind him, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. For all the upheaval of recent weeks, she saw in Robert's visit a glimmer of hope, not just for him, but for the work they had begun together. The foundation, she realized, was not simply a tribute to the past, but a way forward, a bridge between what had been and what could be. Outside, Robert stepped into the cold evening air, his breath visible in the fading light. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond ambition or reputation. He didn't know if he could ever fully make amends for his past, but he knew he had to try, and that, perhaps, was enough. The weeks following Robert's visit passed in a quiet rhythm for Eleanor Mayfield. Winter deepened, draping the streets in a blanket of frost, while the foundation began to take root in the community it sought to serve. Eleanor found herself both drawn to and wary of this new chapter in her life. The foundation had already begun offering aid to those in need, and its name, bearing both hers and Martha Kensington's, was spoken with admiration. Yet, Eleanor still grappled with the attention it brought, her instinct to retreat warring with a growing sense of responsibility. One cold morning, as she swept the streets near the hospital where Martha had once been treated, Eleanor paused to catch her breath. The brisk air stung her lungs, and she leaned against her broom for support. Across the street, she noticed a small group gathered around a young woman who was speaking animatedly to the crowd. Curious, Eleanor crossed the road, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. The woman was handing out flyers for the foundation, her enthusiasm evident in her bright smile and warm gestures. "This foundation is about celebrating the quiet heroes among us," the woman said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "People like Mrs. Mayfield, who remind us that acts of kindness can change lives." Hearing her name, Eleanor felt a flush of discomfort, but stayed hidden at the edge of the crowd. She watched as the woman distributed the flyers, the crowd dispersing with murmurs of appreciation. Once they were gone, Eleanor approached cautiously. "You're doing important work," she said quietly. The young woman turned, startled at first, then broke into a wide smile. "Mrs. Mayfield, it's an honor to meet you." She extended a hand, which Eleanor shook hesitantly. "I'm Lily. I work with the foundation. Mr. Kensington speaks of you often." Eleanor nodded, her expression reserved. "Does he now?" "Yes," Lily replied earnestly. "He says you're the heart of this whole effort." The sincerity in Lily's voice softened Eleanor's guarded demeanor. "It's good to see the foundation reaching people," she said. "That's what matters." Lily nodded, her admiration evident. "You've inspired so many, Mrs. Mayfield." "I hope you know that," Eleanor offered a faint smile, though the weight of Lily's words stayed with her as she walked home. That evening, as she sat by her small table, she found herself staring at the photograph of herself and Martha once again. The memory of their bond felt sharper now, more present, as if Martha's absence was something Eleanor was only now beginning to fully feel. It was with these thoughts that she wrote a letter to Robert Kensington. The act felt old-fashioned, but it allowed her to express herself in a way she struggled to do face to face. She chose her words carefully, her handwriting steady despite the weight of what she wished to say. "Mr. Kensington," she began, I have been thinking a great deal about your mother, about the foundation, and about the path we are now walking together. I wonder sometimes what Martha would think of all this, of her name and mine being spoken in the same breath, of the work you've begun in her memory. I believe she would be proud of you, not because of the attention you've received, but because of the sincerity with which you've approached this mission. For myself, I feel both humbled and uneasy about the recognition. My life has been one of quiet labor, and I never sought the spotlight. Yet seeing the lives that this foundation is already touching, I'm beginning to understand that sometimes our stories are not entirely our own to keep. If sharing my story can help others, then perhaps it is worth the discomfort it brings. Thank you for including me in this work. It has given me much to reflect upon, and though the future remains uncertain, I feel a small measure of hope for what we might accomplish together. She sealed the letter and delivered it to the Foundation's office the next morning, leaving it with a receptionist before returning to her sweeping. The simple act of putting her thoughts into words brought Eleanor a sense of peace, though she couldn't shake the feeling that her story was far from over. When Robert read her letter later that day, he felt a mix of gratitude and humility. Eleanor's words carried a quiet wisdom, one that reminded him of his mother and the values she had tried to instill in him. He resolved to honor her trust by dedicating himself fully to the Foundation's mission. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself more involved in the Foundation's efforts, albeit cautiously. She visited the community center where families gathered to receive aid, spoke with volunteers about their work, and even offered her own insights on how to reach those most in need. Each step was small but significant, and with every interaction, she felt a growing sense of purpose. For Robert, these moments of collaboration deepened his understanding of what it meant to truly serve others. He saw in Eleanor a quiet strength that inspired everyone around her, and he began to realize that his own transformation was only just beginning. Together, they were building something that extended far beyond themselves, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, humility, and connection. As winter stretched on, the Foundation became a beacon of hope for those it served. And while Eleanor still struggled with the attention her story brought, she began to see the ways in which it could inspire others to act, to give, and to believe in the goodness that still existed in the world. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but it was a life that, in its own way, felt meaningful. The early days of spring brought a subtle change to the city, the grey skies softening as buds began to appear on the trees. For Eleanor Mayfield, the shift in season mirrored the slow, quiet transformation she felt within herself. Her once solitary life was now interwoven with the work of the Foundation. Though she still cherished her independence, she had come to see the value in working alongside others, in lending her voice to a cause that reached far beyond her own experiences. Eleanor's mornings remained unchanged. She swept the streets with the same diligence she always had, her broom cutting clean lines across the sidewalk. But now, her afternoons often brought her to the community center, where the Foundation was headquartered. She would sit with volunteers, listening to their stories and offering advice, her presence lending an air of quiet authority. Though she spoke little, her words carried weight, and those around her often found themselves inspired by her calm strength. Robert Kensington had also found a new rhythm to his life, one that revolved less around boardrooms and more around the Foundation's efforts. He had taken to visiting shelters and community centers, speaking with those who benefited from the Foundation's work. These visits humbled him, grounding his lofty ambitions in the realities of the people he sought to help. Yet, even as he threw himself into this new role, he felt the lingering pull of his past, a life spent in pursuit of wealth and power that now felt hollow. One afternoon, As Eleanor sat in the Foundation's modest office reviewing applications for aid, Robert entered the room carrying a stack of letters. He placed them on the desk with a quiet sigh before taking the seat across from her. "Another round of thank you letters," he said, his tone tinged with weariness. "It's heartening, but also overwhelming at times." Eleanor glanced at the pile, her expression thoughtful. "Gratitude can be as heavy as any burden," she replied, "but it's also a reminder of the good this work is doing." Robert nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Do you ever feel inadequate? Like no matter what we do, it's never enough?" Eleanor set her pen down, meeting his gaze. "Often," she admitted, "but I remind myself that small acts can have great ripples. We can't change the world all at once, but we can change it for someone." Her words lingered in the room, a quiet wisdom that struck Robert deeply. He had come to admire Eleanor not just for her sacrifices, but for her unshakable resolve, her ability to see meaning in the smallest gestures. It was a perspective he had spent much of his life missing. As the two continued their work, a knock at the door interrupted the silence. It was Lily, the young woman who had been distributing flyers for the Foundation. Her usual bright demeanor was tempered by urgency. "Mr. Kensington, Mrs. Mayfield," she said, stepping into the room. "There's a situation at one of the shelters we support. A family's been evicted, and they have nowhere to go." "I thought you'd want to know." Eleanor rose immediately, her broom forgotten in the corner. "Where are they now?" "At the shelter," Lily replied, "but they can only stay for the night. The parents are desperate. They've got 2 young children." Eleanor turned to Robert, her expression firm. "We should go." Without hesitation, Robert grabbed his coat, following Eleanor and Lily out the door. The shelter was only a few blocks away, a small, weathered building that bore the marks of years of service. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but quiet, the voices of volunteers mingling with the soft cries of a child. Eleanor approached the family, her movements deliberate but gentle. The mother, a young woman with tired eyes, clutched a baby in her arms, while the father sat beside her, his shoulders hunched in defeat. "I'm Eleanor," she said softly, kneeling to meet their gaze. "I heard about your situation. How can we help?" The mother's voice trembled as she spoke. "We've lost everything. My husband's hours were cut at work, and we couldn't keep up with the rent. We just need somewhere safe to stay until we can get back on our feet." Robert, standing just behind Eleanor, stepped forward. "The Foundation can help with temporary housing," he said firmly. "We'll make sure you're not out on the street." The relief on the couple's faces was immediate, their gratitude spilling out in quiet sobs. As Eleanor sat with them, listening to their story, Robert spoke with the shelter director, arranging for funds to secure temporary accommodations for the family. By the time they left, a plan was in place, and the family's future felt a little less uncertain. As they walked back to the office, Eleanor and Robert were quiet, the weight of the encounter settling over them. It wasn't until they reached the Foundation's door that Eleanor spoke. "This is why the work matters," she said simply. "Not for the recognition, not for the praise, but for moments like that." Robert nodded, his expression reflective. "It's humbling," he admitted, "to realize how much we take for granted and how much we can do with so little." That evening, as Eleanor returned to her apartment, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The day had been long, but it had reminded her of the strength that lay in small acts of compassion. For all the challenges this new chapter had brought, she could see now that her story, her life, had a purpose beyond what she had ever imagined. The chill of early spring lingered in the air as Eleanor Mayfield stood at the edge of the park, gazing at the modest stage that had been erected for the official opening of the Kensington Mayfield Initiative's permanent headquarters. The Foundation, having grown swiftly in its early months, had reached a milestone, a physical space from which it could serve those in need with greater efficiency and reach. Eleanor's name, etched in stone alongside Martha Kensington's, adorned the entryway, a tribute to the two women whose sacrifices and values had inspired the effort. Eleanor was reluctant to attend. The ceremony felt far removed from the quiet acts of kindness that had defined her life, but Robert Kensington had insisted, "This is your work as much as it is anyone's," he had told her. "You belong here." Now, as Eleanor watched the crowd gather, she felt the familiar pull of unease. People she had never met approached her with smiles and kind words, praising her for her bravery and selflessness. She nodded politely, offering only the briefest of replies. For all her humility, Eleanor could not help but wonder if the attention she received diminished the purpose of the foundation. Her story, while meaningful, was only a piece of something much larger. The program began with a speech from Robert, his voice steady as he addressed the audience. He spoke of the Foundation's mission, the lives it had already touched, and the vision for its future. His words carried a sincerity that surprised even Eleanor, who had once doubted his motives. She could see now that the man standing before the crowd had changed. He was no longer driven by ego or ambition, but by a genuine desire to honor his mother's legacy and make amends for the years he had lost. As Robert concluded his speech, he turned to Eleanor, his gaze warm and encouraging. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said, "would you join me up here? I think the people deserve to hear from the heart of this foundation." Eleanor hesitated, her instinct to retreat clashing with a quiet sense of duty. Slowly, she rose from her seat and made her way to the stage. The crowd fell silent as she stepped to the podium, her hands gripping its edges as she steadied herself. "I'm not one for speeches," she began, her voice low but clear. "And I've spent most of my life avoiding attention. But I've come to understand that sometimes our stories aren't just our own. Sometimes they belong to others as much as they belong to us." She paused, her eyes scanning the audience. "This foundation isn't about me or even about Martha Kensington, though it bears our names. It's about all of you, the volunteers who give their time, the donors who believe in this work, and the people we aim to help. It's about reminding each other that kindness, no matter how small, can change the world." The audience erupted in applause, but Eleanor barely heard it. Her mind was elsewhere, recalling the many lives that had intersected with her own over the years. The strangers she had helped in silence, the friendships she had cherished, and the moments of connection that had shaped her. She stepped back from the podium, nodding briefly to Robert as she returned to her seat. The ceremony continued with music and the unveiling of the foundation's plaque, the crowd's energy warm and celebratory. Yet, for Eleanor, the day's significance lay not in the formalities, but in the quiet moments she shared with those around her. A young mother approached her, holding the hand of a child who looked up at Eleanor with wide, curious eyes. "Thank you," the woman said simply, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything you've done." Eleanor offered a faint smile, her hand resting briefly on the child's shoulder. "We all have something to give," she said softly. "I'm just glad I could give a little." As the ceremony wound down, Eleanor found herself standing with Robert near the edge of the crowd. They watched as volunteers packed up chairs and tables, their chatter light and cheerful. "You spoke beautifully," Robert said, his tone earnest. "Thank you for sharing your heart with everyone today." Eleanor shook her head slightly. It wasn't much, but if it helps people see the value in what we're doing, then it was worth it. Robert nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I used to think success was measured by wealth and power," he said quietly, "but I'm starting to see it differently. It's measured in moments like this, in the lives we touch. Eleanor turned to him, her expression softening. "You've come a long way, Mr. Kensington. Your mother would be proud." Her words carried a weight that struck Robert deeply. He had spent years living in the shadow of his own shortcomings, but in Eleanor's eyes he saw a glimmer of the man he hoped to become. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. As the day drew to a close, Eleanor walked home through the quiet streets, her steps slow but purposeful. The foundation had become something larger than she had ever imagined, its reach extending into corners of the community that had long been overlooked. Though she still wrestled with her discomfort at being in the spotlight, she began to see her role not as a burden, but as a responsibility, a way to honor the kindnesses that had shaped her life and to ensure they lived on. The air was cool and crisp as Eleanor reached her apartment. She paused on the steps, looking back at the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. In that moment, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The work was far from over, but for the first time in years, she felt certain that it was work worth doing. Spring unfurled its green tendrils across the city, bringing with it a sense of renewal. Eleanor Mayfield sat by her window, her hands resting in her lap as she gazed out at the street below. The morning light spilled across the sidewalk where she had spent so many years sweeping away debris. Her broom now leaned quietly in the corner, retired after decades of faithful service. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to rest, not because she lacked the will to work, but because the time had come to accept the help she had so often given to others. The Kensington Mayfield Foundation had grown steadily in its outreach. Volunteers bustled about the new headquarters, their energy infectious as they prepared for the day's efforts. Eleanor, though no longer directly involved in every detail, remained a presence of quiet authority. She often visited the center to meet with families, share stories, and lend her ear to those who needed encouragement. Her reluctance to embrace the spotlight had softened, replaced by a realization that her story could inspire others to find strength in their own struggles. Robert Kensington arrived at her apartment that morning, his knock firm but familiar. When Eleanor opened the door, she found him holding a small bouquet of flowers, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to his reserved demeanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Mayfield," he said, offering her the bouquet. "I thought these might brighten your day." Eleanor smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you, Mr. Kensington. That's very thoughtful of you." She invited him in, the two settling at her modest kitchen table. Robert had grown comfortable in her presence over the months, their conversations now marked by an easy familiarity. As they sipped their tea, he shared updates about the foundation, his tone tinged with pride. "We've started a scholarship program," he said, "for students pursuing careers in social work and community service. I thought it was a fitting way to honor the values my mother held dear and the work you've inspired." Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's good work, Mr. Kensington. Your mother would be proud." Her words carried weight, as they always did, and Robert felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Yet he couldn't shake the lingering feeling that he owed her more, not just for her role in saving his mother's life, but for the way she had guided him toward becoming a better man. "I've been thinking about something," Robert said, his voice steady. "About everything you've done, not just for my mother, but for so many others. I know you've never sought recognition, but I believe your story deserves to be preserved for the foundation and for the people it will help in the future." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" "I'd like to document your story," Robert explained, "not in a way that feels intrusive, but as a part of the Foundation's history. Something future generations can look to as a reminder of what one person's kindness can achieve." Eleanor considered his words carefully, her hands clasped in her lap. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But only if it's done in a way that respects the people we're trying to help." "Of course," Robert replied, his relief evident. "That's all I could ask." Their conversation turned to lighter topics, and as Robert prepared to leave, Eleanor walked him to the door. The flowers he had brought now rested in a small vase on her table, their bright petals catching the morning light. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Kensington," she said, her voice warm. "It's always good to see you." "The feeling is mutual, Mrs. Mayfield," Robert replied with a smile. "Take care." As he walked down the steps, Eleanor watched him go, her heart filled with a quiet pride. She had come to see Robert not as the man he had once been, but as the person he was becoming, a man who had found purpose in service, just as she had. That afternoon, Eleanor ventured to the community center, where a group of children were gathered for an art workshop sponsored by the foundation. She moved quietly among them, her presence calming as she admired their work. One child, a boy no older than 8, held up a drawing of a sweeping broom surrounded by flowers. "It's for you," he said shyly, "because you always help people." Eleanor knelt to meet his gaze, her eyes soft with emotion. "Thank you," she said gently. "It's beautiful." The child's words stayed with her as she returned home, her steps slow but purposeful. The foundation had become more than a tribute to her and Martha Kensington. It was a living testament to the power of kindness, a beacon for those who sought hope in difficult times. And though Eleanor's name was etched in stone, she understood that her true legacy lay in the lives she had touched and the example she had set. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the city, Eleanor sat by her window once more. The streets below were quiet, the bustle of the day giving way to the stillness of evening. In her heart, she felt a sense of peace, a peace born not of solitude, but of connection, of knowing that her life had mattered in ways she could never have imagined. Eleanor Mayfield's days unfolded with a quiet rhythm that suited her. Though she had retired from her work sweeping the city streets, her mornings were still spent walking familiar routes. She often paused to greet neighbors, some of whom she had known for years, and others who had come to recognize her through her connection to the Kensington Mayfield Foundation. These walks brought her a sense of peace, a way to stay connected to the city that had been her constant companion through decades of both joy and hardship. At the foundation, the work pressed forward, and Eleanor remained an enduring figure within its walls. She attended meetings occasionally, offering her insights sparingly, but with the quiet authority of someone who had lived the lessons others only theorized about. The staff admired her deeply, and her presence lent the foundation a sense of authenticity that no amount of polished marketing could replicate. One afternoon, Eleanor was invited to a gathering at the foundation's headquarters. The event was a modest celebration of the foundation's accomplishments, with volunteers and community members coming together to share stories and reflect on the progress they had made. Eleanor arrived early, as was her habit, and was greeted warmly by Lily, who had become one of the foundation's most dedicated coordinators. "Mrs. Mayfield," Lily said, her eyes bright with excitement, "I'm so glad you're here. We have something special planned." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "I hope it's nothing too extravagant. You know I don't care for fuss." Lily laughed. "I promise it's nothing too fancy, but I think you'll like it." As the room filled with familiar faces, Robert Kensington took to the small stage at the front. His transformation over the past year was evident to all who knew him. He carried himself with humility, his voice steady but free of the arrogance that had once defined him. "Thank you all for being here," Robert began. "Today is about more than celebrating the Foundation's achievements. It's about the people who make this work possible. People like you, who give your time, your resources, and your compassion. And of course, people like Mrs. Mayfield, whose example continues to inspire us all. The room erupted in applause, and Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She offered a small wave of acknowledgement, but remained seated, unwilling to draw more attention than necessary. Robert continued, his tone growing more reflective. As we look to the future, it's important to remember where we started and the values that brought us here. This foundation exists because of the lessons my mother taught me and the sacrifices Mrs. Mayfield made. It's a legacy built on kindness, resilience, and the belief that even small acts of generosity can change lives. At the back of the room, Eleanor watched as a slideshow of photographs appeared on the screen behind Robert. Images of the Foundation's work filled the space, families receiving food and clothing, children learning in after-school programs, volunteers working tirelessly to improve the lives of others. Mixed among these were pictures of Martha Kensington, her warm smile a constant reminder of the woman who had inspired it all. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, a photograph of herself appeared on the screen. It was an older picture, taken by a local journalist during one of her shifts as a street sweeper. In the image, Eleanor stood with her broom in hand, her face worn but determined, framed by the bustle of the city around her. The room grew quiet, the weight of the moment settling over the crowd. Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at the image. She hadn't seen herself that way in years. Her work had always felt ordinary, something done without expectation of recognition. To see it presented as a symbol of strength and dignity was almost overwhelming. When the presentation ended, Robert stepped down from the stage and approached Eleanor, his expression sincere. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Eleanor nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "It's not just me, Mr. Kensington. It's all of us." After the event, Eleanor stayed behind to speak with a few volunteers. One young woman approached her, shy but eager. "Mrs. Mayfield," she said, "I just wanted to say how much you've inspired me. My grandmother used to tell me stories about women like you, strong, selfless, always putting others first. I hope I can live up to that example." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. "The fact that you're here, doing this work, tells me you already are." As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor walked home under a sky painted with the deep hues of twilight. The streets were quiet, the air cool but not cold, and she felt a sense of calm settle over her. The foundation, the people it served, and the community it had built were all testaments to what could be achieved when people came together with a shared purpose. In her apartment, Eleanor sat by her window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She thought of Martha, of the bond they had shared, and of the unlikely friendship that had brought so much good into the world. Her life had taken a path she could never have imagined, but as she reflected on the journey, she felt no regret, only gratitude. Eleanor Mayfield awoke early, the soft light of dawn streaming through her curtains. She sat at the edge of her bed for a moment, gazing at the photograph of her late son, Daniel, on the small nightstand. His youthful smile brought a familiar ache, one that time had softened but never erased. She traced her fingers over the frame, her mind wandering to memories of him and the life they had shared before loss had reshaped her world. Her days had become a blend of reflection and quiet action. Though she no longer swept the city streets, she remained a part of the community in her own unobtrusive way. The foundation had provided her with the means to live more comfortably, yet she refused to indulge in luxury. Her small apartment, modest and carefully kept, was enough. She found joy in simple things, a neighbor's greeting, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the block, the laughter of children playing in the park. That morning, Eleanor had an appointment at the Foundation's headquarters. It wasn't an official meeting, but Robert Kensington had invited her to meet a group of volunteers and beneficiaries who wanted to express their gratitude. She hesitated at first, uncertain whether her presence would add value, but Robert had insisted. "We wouldn't be where we are without you, Mrs. Mayfield," he had said. "You remind people of what this work is all about." As she walked the familiar streets toward the Foundation, the brisk air carried the scent of blooming flowers and faintly damp earth. It was a season of renewal, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel its resonance in her own life. At the Foundation, she was greeted warmly by Lily, who had become a dear friend over the months. "Mrs. Mayfield," Lily said, her face lighting up, "you're just in time." "Everyone's waiting in the main hall." Eleanor followed her, her steps measured but steady. Inside the hall, a small gathering of people, families, young professionals and older volunteers, stood in a semicircle. Their faces brightened as she entered, and for a moment, Eleanor felt the familiar pang of discomfort that came with being the center of attention. Yet, as she looked at the faces around her, she saw genuine gratitude and admiration, and her unease softened. One by one, individuals stepped forward to share their stories. A single mother spoke of the childcare program that had allowed her to return to work. A retired veteran described how the Foundation had helped him find housing after years of instability. A teenager, clutching a certificate, tearfully thanked the Foundation for the scholarship that would allow her to pursue her dream of becoming a teacher. Eleanor listened intently, her hands clasped in front of her. Each story reminded her of why the work mattered, not because of the recognition she had received, but because of the lives that had been changed. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm not one for speeches," she began, her voice steady but humble. "But hearing your stories today has reminded me of something my mother used to say. Kindness is like a seed. You may not see it grow right away, but if you plant it, it will bloom." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "This Foundation isn't about me or about the name it carries. It's about all of you, about the strength and resilience you've shown in the face of hardship. It's about the volunteers who give their time and the donors who believe in the work we're doing. Together, we're planting seeds that will grow into something beautiful." The room erupted in applause, but Eleanor remained composed, stepping back into the circle with a small smile. Lily squeezed her hand, her eyes shining with admiration. As the event wound down, Robert approached Eleanor, his expression thoughtful. "That was beautiful, Mrs. Mayfield. You have a way of speaking that reaches people." "I just spoke the truth," she replied simply. Robert nodded, his respect for her evident. "There's one more thing I wanted to show you before you leave." He led her to a quiet corner of the building where a plaque had been installed. It bore the Foundation's name, along with a simple inscription, "In honor of Martha Kensington and Eleanor Mayfield, whose lives remind us that even the smallest acts of kindness can transform the world." Eleanor stared at the words, her chest tightening. She reached out to touch the smooth metal, her fingers tracing the letters. For a moment, she felt the weight of all that had led to this moment, the losses she had endured, the sacrifices she had made, and the unexpected turns her life had taken. "It's a fine thing you've done here," she said softly. "Your mother would be proud." "And so would your son," Robert replied, his voice gentle. "You've built a legacy, Mrs. Mayfield, one that will endure." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. "We've built it together." As she walked home that evening, the streets seemed quieter, the light softer. She carried with her a sense of peace, a recognition that her life, though marked by sorrow, had been filled with meaning. At her apartment, she sat by the window, the city lights twinkling like stars. In her heart, she felt a deep gratitude for the people who had touched her life, for the work she had been a part of, and for the promise of all that was still to come. Eleanor Mayfield's days continued in the steady rhythm she had grown accustomed to, but there was a subtle change in the air around her, a quiet warmth that came from the connections she had forged through the Foundation's work. Her name had become synonymous with compassion, yet she still saw herself as simply a woman who had done what she could with the life she had been given. One crisp morning, as Eleanor prepared her modest breakfast, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Lily standing there, holding an envelope in her hand. The young woman's face carried a mix of curiosity and reverence, as if she knew the contents of the envelope held something significant. "This came for you," Lily said, handing it over. "It was sent to the Foundation's office, but I thought you'd want to open it privately." Eleanor thanked her, inviting her in for tea, though her curiosity about the envelope was growing. Once Lily had left and the apartment was quiet again, Eleanor settled into her favorite chair by the window and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in a delicate hand that made her pause. Attached to it was an old, creased photograph, one she recognized instantly. It was of her son, Daniel, as a young boy, standing beside Martha Kensington on a summer afternoon. Eleanor's breath caught as she traced the image with her fingers. She turned to the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she began to read. The letter was written by a woman named Clara, a distant relative of Martha's, who had recently come across some belongings while clearing out an old attic. Clara explained that she had found the photograph among a stack of letters Daniel had written as a child, addressed to Martha but never sent. She had thought it best to return them to Eleanor, believing they might hold some meaning for her. Eleanor set the photograph aside and unfolded one of the letters, her heart tightening as she recognized Daniel's boyish handwriting. The first line brought tears to her eyes. "Dear Mrs. Kensington, thank you for always being so kind to my mum. I know she works very hard, and it makes me happy that she has a friend like you." She read on, her tears falling freely now. Daniel's letters were filled with simple observations, a child's view of the world, but they carried a depth of love and gratitude that made her chest ache. He wrote about his school projects, the stories Eleanor had told him, and his dreams of growing up to help people in the way his mother did. One letter stood out, written not long before the accident that had taken Daniel's life. It was a promise, written in careful, deliberate words. "I will always try to be like you and Mrs. Kensington, Mom. You both show me how to be kind. When I grow up, I'll help people too." Eleanor sat for a long time, the letters spread across her lap, the photograph resting on the small table beside her. Her son's voice, so clear in his writing, seemed to echo in the quiet of the room. She thought of how much she had missed him, of the years that had passed without him, and of the ways his spirit had lived on in her work. Later that day, Eleanor brought the letters to the Foundation's office. She found Robert Kensington in his usual spot, poring over documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his face softening into a smile. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said warmly, "what brings you here?" Eleanor placed the letters and photograph on the desk in front of him. "These belong to Daniel," she said simply. "He wrote them to your mother." Robert's expression shifted as he picked up the photograph, his eyes lingering on the image of Martha and Daniel. "I had no idea they were so close," he said softly. "She was a constant presence in our lives," Eleanor replied, "more than I realized at the time. These letters reminded me of how much she meant to Daniel and to me." Robert set the photograph down carefully, his voice filled with reverence. "Your son had a beautiful spirit, Mrs. Mayfield. It's clear he inherited that from you." Eleanor nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. He saw the best in people, even when life wasn't easy. It's why I've tried to carry on his kindness in whatever way I could. They sat in quiet reflection for a moment before Robert spoke again. We should preserve these letters as part of the Foundation's history, if you're comfortable with that. They tell a story, not just of your son, but of the values this foundation is built on. Eleanor considered his words, her gaze distant. I think Daniel would like that, she said finally. He wanted his life to matter, even in small ways. As she left the office that day, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace. Her son's words, preserved in those letters, had reminded her of the threads that connected her past to her present, the people she had loved, the values they had shared, and the legacy they had built together. The foundation, she realized, was not just her story or Martha's, it was Daniel's as well. It was a testament to all the ways kindness could endure, weaving itself into the lives of those who needed it most. Eleanor Mayfield stood before the modest headstone in the cemetery's quiet corner, her coat wrapped tightly around her against the crisp winter air. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, gathering on the ground in a soft, unbroken sheet. Beside her stood Robert Kensington, a bouquet of white lilies in his hand. They were silent for a long moment, the weight of memory filling the stillness between them. The grave before them bore the name Martha Kensington and the dates that marked her long life. Beneath it was the simple inscription, "Her kindness lives on in every life she touched." It was a truth Eleanor felt keenly. Martha's influence had reached beyond her own family, binding together lives in ways that no one could have foreseen. Robert knelt and placed the lilies at the base of the headstone. "Thank you, Mother," he said softly, his voice steady but full of emotion, "for everything." Eleanor watched him, her hands clasped before her. "She was proud of you," she said after a moment, "even when you didn't see it yourself. She knew you'd find your way." Robert stood, brushing the snow from his knees. "It took me longer than it should have," he admitted, "but she never gave up on me. And neither did you, in your own way." Eleanor shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "It wasn't about giving up or holding on, Mr. Kensington. It was about seeing what was always there, waiting for the right time to grow." They lingered a while longer, the snow continuing to fall, blanketing the world in a hushed stillness. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer. "There's someone else I'd like to visit while we're here." Robert nodded, understanding at once. Together, they made their way to another grave, one tucked further into the cemetery's quiet embrace. This one bore the name Daniel Mayfield and a simple inscription, "Forever in our hearts." Eleanor's breath caught as she gazed at the headstone, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of its cold surface. She knelt, her movements slow but deliberate, and placed a small, folded letter at the base of the grave. "I brought something for you, Daniel," she said softly, "words I wish I'd said when you were here." Robert stood a respectful distance away, his gaze lowered. The moment felt sacred, a convergence of past and present, love and loss. Eleanor remained kneeling for a long time, her head bowed as she whispered words meant only for her son. When she finally stood, her eyes glistened, though her expression was calm. She turned to Robert, her voice steady. "He would have liked you," she said. "You remind me of him in some ways, determined, kind-hearted, though he was always quicker to see the good in people." Robert smiled faintly, humbled by her words. "That's a high compliment," he said. "I'll do my best to live up to it." They walked back through the snow-dusted paths, their steps slow and unhurried. The weight of the visit, though heavy, brought with it a sense of closure. For Eleanor, the past and present had finally converged, allowing her to embrace what had been while still looking forward. For Robert, it was a moment of reckoning and gratitude, a reminder of the lives that had shaped his own and the responsibility he now carried. As they reached the cemetery gates, Eleanor paused and turned to Robert. "This work we've started, it's not just about remembering the past," she said. "It's about making sure the kindness we've known carries forward. It's about planting seeds that will grow long after we're gone." Robert nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll see to it, Mrs. Mayfield. I promise you that." She smiled faintly, her face lined with both weariness and hope. "I believe you will." Later that evening, Eleanor sat in her small apartment, the photograph of Martha and Daniel resting on the table before her. The letters Daniel had written, now carefully preserved, sat in a small box beside it. She thought of the foundation, the lives it had touched, and the legacy it continued to build. It was a legacy that belonged not to her alone, but to all those who had been part of the journey. The snow outside her window fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the city. Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the work she had begun would carry on, shaped by the hands of others who shared her belief in the power of kindness. She reached for a pen and a sheet of paper, her thoughts turning to those she had lost and those who remained. In the quiet of the evening, she began to write, not for recognition or posterity, but as a way of honoring the threads that connected her life to so many others. Each word was a testament to the enduring power of love, resilience, and the simple yet profound act of helping one another. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.